So let me ask you something weird. When you think of mathematics, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture chalkboards covered in equations, a tired teacher with coffee breath, or maybe just that feeling of staring at a problem set at 3 in the morning wondering why numbers even exist. But here's the thing. Math is not only about humans. It turns out some animals can do math too. Now, before you imagine a horse solving calculus or a crow quietly working on quadratic equations, let's slow down. We are not talking about animals discovering new branches of mathematics. They're not publishing research papers, at least not yet. But what we are talking about is something that might be even more fascinating. Animals seem to have a kind of built-in number sense. They can tell more from less. They can recognize patterns. Some of them can even add and subtract small amounts. And when I say some of them, I don't mean just the clever monkeys or dolphins. I mean birds, fish, even bees. It's almost like math didn't start with us at all. It was already hidden in the fabric of nature, waiting for us to notice. But before we get into those amazing stories, let's step back. Because the very idea of animals doing math is honestly hilarious. Imagine sitting in a classroom and the kid next to you is a crow raising its wing to answer the teacher. Or you're trying to cheat on your math test, but the parrot sitting behind you whispers the right answer. Okay, maybe that's not the world we live in, but in a way it's not that far from the truth. Here's the question. Why would animals need math at all? Think about it. If you're a crow living in the wild, you don't need to know trigonometry to survive, but you might need to keep track of how many shiny coins you've hidden in a secret stash. If you're a monkey, you might want to know which tree has more bananas. If you're a fish, you might want to join the bigger school of fish, because more fish means more safety. So math isn't just some human invention to torture students, it's a survival tool, a natural instinct, and that's where our story begins. I want to take you on a journey, a 2-hour journey actually. Don't worry, I'll keep it fun, I'll keep it cozy, and if you fall asleep somewhere along the way, I'll take that as a compliment. That's the whole point. But I promise, even if your eyes start closing, your brain will still be entertained by the bizarre and wonderful ways animals have been doing math long before calculators were a thing. So what do we mean when we say animals can do math? Scientists usually call it numerosity. It's the ability to recognize quantities without actually counting one by one. You and I do it all the time. If you see 3 apples on the table, you don't count 1, 2, 3. You just know there are 3. Babies do this. And apparently so do crows, monkeys, and even chickens. In fact, baby chicks can tell the difference between 2 objects and 3 objects, which is kind of unfair because I know plenty of adults who can't even tell the difference between 2 parking tickets and 3 parking tickets until it's too late. There's another word for this talent, subitizing. It sounds fancy, but it's basically the brain's fast way of saying, yeah, that's 4. Don't waste time counting. Most humans can subitize up to about 4 items instantly. Beyond that, we usually start counting. But animals, many of them seem to have the same limit, which is interesting. It suggests that the roots of number sense go back deep into evolution. We didn't invent it. We just built skyscrapers on top of something that was already there. Now, let me tell you a funny story. Back in ancient Greece, there was a philosopher named Pliny the Elder. He loved to write down strange stories, some of them true, some of them less true. According to him, certain birds, like crows and ravens, could actually count. He said, if you tried to trick a crow by hiding hunters near its nest, the crow would notice. If 4 hunters went in, the crow waited until all 4 came out before it relaxed. If one stayed behind, the crow somehow knew. That's over 2,000 years ago. People were already noticing animal math. Fast forward to today, and scientists are still running experiments to test those ancient claims. And here's the twist. A lot of them turn out to be right. Crows really can tell numbers. Not perfectly, but well enough to make you wonder. Of course, humans being humans, we didn't always study this with kindness. Some experiments from the early 20th century are honestly a bit cruel. Animals were put in weird situations just to see if they could figure out 2 plus 2. But the results were still eye-opening. Not only did animals show a basic number sense, they sometimes showed it in ways that surprised researchers. Take dolphins, for example. They've been trained to recognize numbers on boards and then press the correct paddle. And they did it with the same kind of mistakes humans make, which is, frankly, both heartwarming and humbling. Imagine training for years in math, only to find out a dolphin is making the exact same errors as you. So what's the bigger picture here? Why should we care if animals can count? Well, because it changes how we think about intelligence. For a long time, people assumed humans were special because we invented numbers. But the more we study, the more we realize we didn't invent the feeling of numbers. We just dressed it up with symbols, equations, and fancy names. The raw sense of more and less has been around for millions of years. It lives in the brains of birds, mammals, and probably even insects. Think about bees. We'll talk about them in detail later, but bees can apparently recognize numbers up to 4 or 5. They use this to find flowers more efficiently. So when you're struggling with your grocery bill at the checkout, remember, somewhere out there a bee is doing math better than you. And here's where it gets even cooler. Modern neuroscience suggests that the same brain regions we humans use for math light up in animals too. That means when a monkey is choosing between 2 piles of fruit, it's basically using the same kind of brain power that we use to solve equations. The difference is only in scale. They use math to get lunch. We use math to send rockets to Mars. So in this video we're going to dive deep into all of this. We'll meet clever crows who outsmart scientists, horses who fooled an entire nation, monkeys who basically invented money, and bees who know geometry better than most humans. Along the way we'll laugh at the absurdity of it all, we'll explore some fascinating history, and we'll slowly unravel what mathematics really is. Because here's the truth. Math is not just about solving problems on paper. It's a way of understanding the world. And if animals can share even a small part of that, then maybe math isn't this cold, abstract human creation. Maybe it's part of life itself. So grab your blanket, get comfortable, and let's step into the strange and delightful world of animal mathematics. Let's rewind the clock. Not just a little, I mean really rewind. Way before humans started carving tally marks on bones or scribbling on clay tablets. Before writing, before cities, before fire even. Back to the time when the world was just animals, plants, and a whole lot of survival. Now, here's a question. Did numbers exist back then? Not numbers the way we write them. Not the squiggly symbols, not the calculators. I mean the raw idea of more and less. The difference between one and many. The difference between one and many. The difference between safe and dangerous. If you think about it, numbers are baked into the natural world. A lion doesn't need algebra to hunt, but it definitely needs to know the difference between 1 zebra and 10 zebras. Because 1 zebra is dinner. 10 zebras? That's probably a bad day. And take birds. A mother bird leaves her nest, flies off to grab food, and comes back. She looks at her chicks. If she had 3 chicks before, and now she sees only 2, she knows something's wrong. She doesn't count 1, 2, 3 like we do. She just senses it. That missing shape, that missing voice. It registers. That's number sense. Scientists believe this kind of sense is ancient, like hundreds of millions of years old. Way older than humans. You can almost imagine nature itself whispering math into the brains of creatures because math helps you survive. Let's make it simple. If you're a tiny fish swimming in the ocean, you want to stay in a group. Why? Because predators have a harder time picking you off when you're surrounded by friends. But here's the twist. Fish can tell the difference between a small group and a big group. Put 5 fish in one tank, 10 in another, and release a single fish to choose where to swim. Almost every time the fish chooses the bigger group. No calculator, no notebook, just instinct. That's prehistoric mathematics. Now, when I say prehistoric math, I don't mean some cave lion carving equations into rocks. I mean the silent rules of life. The idea that more is safer. The idea that 1 is lonelier than 2. That's math before humans gave it a name. And humans eventually noticed this. Long before there were scientists in lab coats, people watched animals and realized they're not just reacting, they're reasoning. They're making choices based on amounts. Ancient farmers must have seen it. Shepherds probably laughed when they saw goats keeping track of their kids better than the shepherd could. Here's one of my favorite little historical notes. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once said that some animals clearly had a sense of number. He wrote that even the smallest birds could distinguish between 3 and 4. That was more than 2,000 years ago, and he was already hinting at what modern science is proving now. Not bad for a guy who didn't have access to brain scans or statistical software. But let's go back even further. Imagine the first humans. living in small groups, surrounded by animals. They didn't think of math as a subject. They thought of it as survival. If you're out hunting and you see 3 mammoths, you'd better know that 3 is more than the 2 hunters standing next to you. If you can't figure that out, congratulations, you just became mammoth food. And of course, they also noticed the animals themselves were doing little calculations. Wolves knew when their pack was strong enough to chase prey. Birds knew when it was time to fly away because too many predators showed up. Everywhere you look, it's numbers in action. It's kind of funny to think about, but maybe numbers existed before humans ever said the word. Numbers were in the patterns of leaves on a plant, in the rhythm of footsteps in a herd, in the way day turns into night, and night back into day. All math really is, at its core, is a way to describe patterns, and nature has always been full of patterns. Even rhythm is math. Crickets chirping in patterns to attract mates. Frogs croaking back and forth like some bizarre algebra class in the swamp. You could say that long before humans discovered mathematics, the forest was already alive with equations. They just weren't written down. They were sung, croaked, chirped, and danced. And it wasn't only about counting objects. Early number sense could also mean recognizing order. Think of ants marching in a line. They don't stop and go, am I the 3rd ant or the 5th ant? But they do understand sequence. They know who follows who, and they know when the order is broken. Sequence is math. Order is math. Modern scientists run all sorts of experiments to dig into this. They show animals 2 piles of food or 2 groups of sounds or flashes of light, and they record which pile or sound the animal prefers. The amazing thing is how consistent the results are. Birds, mammals, even insects often show the same basic math ability, a sense of more versus less. And it's not random, it's systematic. What does this tell us? It tells us that math is not something invented out of thin air by humans with too much free time. It's something deep, something ancient. Humans didn't create math. We uncovered it. Animals were already living it. Let me give you one last thought. Imagine you're a crow perched on a tree branch 50,000 years ago. You're watching a group of hunters walk into the forest. You notice how many there are. 4. Later, you see only 3 leave. Something's wrong. You don't need language for that. You don't need symbols. You just know. That's numbers. That's survival. And that's also, in a very real way, mathematics. So when people say math is a human invention, I like to laugh a little, because long before humans started writing numbers, math was already happening. The world was counting, adding, subtracting, and organizing itself. Animals were doing their own rough calculations. The stars were moving in predictable rhythms. Plants were unfurling leaves in spirals that follow mathematical ratios. Math was here before us. Math will be here after us. And in between, we're just along for the ride. Picture this. You're an early human. No smartphones, no TikTok, not even bread. You're living in a small group, and every day is basically a survival video game with no cheat codes. You're surrounded by animals, wolves, birds, horses, goats, and you start noticing something odd. These creatures, the ones you thought were just food or future shoes, sometimes act smart, not human smart, but smart enough to make you go, wait a second, did that crow just outwit me? One of the oldest human observations about animals was that they could tell the difference between amounts. Hunters in ancient times learned this the hard way. You send 4 people into a forest to trap birds, and the birds don't come back until they see all 4 leave. Even if 3 hunters leave and 1 stays hidden, the birds won't relax. That's not coincidence, that's counting. Or at least that's something very close. Stories like this were passed down for generations. By the time the Greeks started writing things down, people were already convinced that certain animals had a sense of number. Aristotle himself mentioned that some birds could distinguish between small numbers like 2 and 3, or 3 and 4. He didn't think they were doing math in the way humans did, but he recognized that animals were keeping track. And then you have Pliny the Elder. This guy loved collecting odd facts like the world's first Wikipedia editor. He wrote that crows were basically little accountants of the sky. He claimed they could count up to 5, maybe even more. He wasn't running lab experiments, but he was paying attention to what people saw in the wild. Hunters, farmers, shepherds, they all noticed. The animals weren't just reacting blindly, they were observing, remembering, and yes, calculating. Let's pause and think about early farmers. Imagine being a shepherd with a flock of sheep. You lead them out to graze. You're not super confident in your own math skills. But guess what? The sheep are paying attention. If a lamb goes missing, the mother sheep notices instantly. She doesn't do a roll call, but she knows one is gone. That's more than instinct. That's number sense. And to the shepherd, it must have been both useful and a little creepy. It's like the sheep were doing his job for him. Now, humans in the ancient world often mixed these observations with mythology. If an animal seemed to count, it wasn't just interesting, it was magical. Think about wolves in Roman mythology. The she-wolf who raised Romulus and Remus wasn't just a random wolf. She was clever, nurturing and almost human-like. Same with birds in Norse myths. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, weren't just messengers. They were wise, maybe even mathematicians in their own mysterious way. But here's where it gets funnier. Humans didn't always assume animals were smart. Sometimes we assumed they were too smart. There are medieval stories about ravens counting coins, dogs calculating travel distances, even pigs solving puzzles. Were these true? Probably not. But the fact that people told these stories shows something important. Humans were already fascinated by the possibility that math wasn't ours alone. Let's fast forward a bit. In the Middle Ages, falconers trained hunting birds. They swore the birds knew how to keep track of prey, not just food versus no food, but specific numbers. There are records of falcons ignoring smaller flocks in favor of bigger ones, as if they were running cost-benefit analyses in their little bird brains. Economists would later call this rational choice theory. Falcons were just living it. The more humans observed, the more suspicious it became. Was math really this sacred, human-only gift? Or was it just a trick of nature, shared across species? By the Renaissance, this question started poking into science. Natural philosophers, basically scientists before science was a word, ran little tests. They didn't always get it right, but they kept noticing the same thing. Animals weren't clueless. They were keeping track of things. Think of it this way. Early humans didn't just discover animals could count. They discovered animals could outcount humans when humans weren't paying attention. Imagine you're a farmer with a chicken coop. You think you've grabbed all the eggs, but the hen is furious. Why? Because she knows you left one behind. You don't need a PhD to see what's happening. The chicken has a better handle on arithmetic than you do. And humans, being humans, didn't just study this. They used it. Trainers, circus performers, even con artists started playing with the idea that animals could count. They taught dogs to bark the right number of times, or horses to tap their hooves. Sometimes it was genuine animal talent. Sometimes it was a clever trick. But the fascination was always the same. Animals doing math felt like breaking some kind of cosmic rule. So here's the important part. Long before psychology labs and controlled experiments, humans had already noticed animal math. They saw it in hunting, in farming, in myth, and in everyday life. Animals were keeping track of numbers, and for humans that was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it meant we weren't alone in the universe of numbers. Unsettling because it blurred the line between us and everything else. And maybe that's why these stories kept surviving. Every culture had them, from African folk tales about clever hyenas who tricked hunters, to Chinese stories about wise cranes who never forgot how many people approached their nests. Everywhere you look, people were whispering the same thing. The animals are smarter than we think. Now, I'm not saying these early humans were running perfect experiments. They didn't have double-blind studies or peer review. What they had was curiosity. They watched, they noticed patterns, and they told stories. And in those stories, animals weren't just background characters. They were mathematicians in disguise. And here's the twist. Modern science is proving that a lot of those old observations weren't just tall tales. Animals really do have a number sense. Maybe not as advanced as ours, but real, measurable, and surprisingly sharp. In other words, the ancient hunters, shepherds, and storytellers weren't crazy. They were just paying attention. So when we look back, we see a fascinating thread. Humans first discovered math in themselves, but at the same time they discovered it in animals. And maybe that's why math feels so natural. It's not just something we invented in a vacuum. It's something we share with the world around us. Let's talk about crows. You know those black-feathered birds that hang around parking lots, making suspicious noises like they're plotting something? Well, maybe they actually are. Because when it comes to brains, crows are in a league of their own. And not just smart for a bird, I mean smart in ways that make us uncomfortable. Here's the thing. Humans have always had a weird relationship with crows. Some cultures saw them as bad omens, others treated them as wise, almost magical. But across history, one theme kept popping up. Crows aren't just noisy sky goblins, they are problem solvers, they are planners, and most shockingly, they are counters. Scientists started noticing this a long time ago. Remember Pliny the Elder from earlier? He wrote that crows could count up to 4 or 5, and modern experiments suggest he wasn't exaggerating. Put food in front of a crow, hide it behind a screen, move it around, crows keep track. They know how much food is there, even if you try to trick them. One classic experiment goes like this. You've got a group of hunters all dressed up in camouflage. They want to sneak up on a crow's nest. They send 3 hunters into the hideout. 2 hunters leave. The crow sits there staring, waiting. Why? Because it knows one is still inside. The crow doesn't come back to the nest until it sees all 3 leave. That's not luck, that's arithmetic. It gets even better. In some lab tests, crows were trained to peck at screens with dots on them. Show a crow 3 dots, and it pecks 3 times. Show it 5 dots, it pecks 5 times. That alone is impressive. But here's the kicker. Crows actually make the same mistakes humans make. If you show them 6 dots very fast, sometimes they miscount and say it's 5, which is hilarious, because it means crows and humans might be running the same mental software for numbers. The only difference is that humans put their mistakes into Excel spreadsheets, while crows just shrug and fly away. And it's not just counting. Crows also understand concepts like 0. Yeah, you heard that right. 0. The number nothing. The one that humans struggled with for centuries. The one that made ancient mathematicians sweat and argue. Crows, they figured it out. In some experiments, crows were shown images with no objects, and they treated nothing as a real category, different from 1. That's wild. It took humans thousands of years of philosophy and debate to understand 0. Crows just casually get it. But maybe the most jaw-dropping thing about crows is how they use their math skills in the real world. They remember how many pieces of food they've hidden. They track debts in crow society. Yes, debts. If a crow shares food with another, it remembers and later expects payback. It's like they're running tiny spreadsheets in their heads. Imagine if your neighbor was a crow and remembered every single time you borrowed a cup of sugar. You'd never escape the debt. And they don't just track food, they track people. Studies have shown that crows can recognize human faces and even remember how many times a particular human has messed with them. If a scientist bothers a crow once, the crow remembers. If the same person bothers it 3 times, the crow doesn't just get annoyed, it tells its friends. The whole murder of crows, yes, that's what a group is called. A murder keeps score. So basically they're running statistics on us, which is a little terrifying. There's even evidence that crows pass down this information across generations. Imagine your grandma crow sitting you down and saying, "Listen, kid, never trust the guy in the red hat. He owes me food." That's not science fiction, that's real crow culture. And culture means memory, sharing, maybe even teaching. Suddenly the line between human math and animal math starts to blur. Now, let me give you a fun twist. Crows don't just understand numbers, they sometimes outdo us at problem solving. There's a famous experiment where a crow had to drop stones into a tube of water to raise the level high enough to reach floating food. That's straight out of Aesop's fables. But it wasn't just a story. The crow actually did it. It figured out volume displacement, which, by the way, is something Archimedes discovered in a bathtub after decades of thought. The crow just winged it, literally. And the best part, the crow chose the right stones. It ignored ones that were too light and picked heavier ones to get the job done faster. That's physics, that's logic, and you better believe there's a little arithmetic going on in its head. So let's zoom out. What does all this mean? It means crows don't just live in our world, they calculate it, they plan, they count, they even anticipate. And when you put all of that together, it's almost like they've got a math class going on in the treetops. Of course, they're not perfect. No crow is going to sit down and prove Fermat's last theorem, but maybe that's because they don't need to. Their math is practical. It's survival math, the kind that says there are 4 hunters in the woods. Don't come back until all 4 are gone. Or, I buried 3 nuts. If I only see 2, Something's wrong. And you know what? That's the foundation of all mathematics. Counting, keeping track, noticing when something doesn't add up. Humans just built skyscrapers on top of it. But crows, they're content running their little equations in the branches. There's even a case to be made that crows are closer to us than we think. In terms of brain-to-body ratio, crows are basically up there with primates. Some researchers even argue that crows should be considered honorary primates when it comes to intelligence, which is kind of insulting to monkeys, but also kind of flattering to crows. So next time you see a crow staring at you, don't assume it's just being creepy. It might be doing math. It might be adding up how many fries you dropped at the park, or calculating how many times you've shooed it away. And trust me, if it's keeping score, you're not going to win. When you hear the word pigeon, what comes to mind? Probably not mathematics. Maybe you picture a slightly confused bird waddling around a city square, trying to steal someone's French fries. Or maybe you think of that one pigeon who always seems to have suspiciously good aim when you're walking under a lamppost. But here's the truth. Pigeons are secretly math nerds. And not just casual math nerds. These birds have shown talents in areas most humans don't even enjoy, like statistics. Yes, the bird you saw yesterday sitting on a statue, looking like it had no thoughts behind those tiny eyes, is out there crunching probability problems better than most of us. Scientists have been running experiments with pigeons for decades, and the results are shocking. Let's start with something simple. Pigeons can count. Not as well as crows, but they've got the basics. In one study, pigeons were trained to peck a certain number of times in response to a number of symbols. If they saw 3 shapes, they pecked 3 times. If they saw 5, they pecked 5 times. That alone would be impressive for a bird whose daily hobbies include walking in small circles and bothering pedestrians. But then things got weirder. Scientists started testing pigeons on statistical patterns, and guess what? The pigeons were amazing at it. For example, researchers showed pigeons sequences of coloured lights. Some sequences followed a pattern, some were random. The pigeons learned to recognise the difference. They could tell when something was statistically unlikely. Imagine that. You struggle through your statistics class in college, and a pigeon just casually beats you at it. One of the most famous experiments put pigeons in a situation where food appeared under different conditions. The pigeons had to figure out the probability of food being in one spot versus another. Over time, the pigeons actually started choosing in a way that matched the statistical probabilities. They weren't guessing randomly. They were calculating likelihood. In other words, pigeons were running mental probability distributions inside their tiny bird brains. Meanwhile, plenty of humans still buy lottery tickets every week. It gets better. Pigeons don't just pick up patterns, they generalize them. Once they learn a statistical rule, they can apply it to new situations. That's the kind of flexibility we usually associate with higher intelligence. And yet here we are, talking about the same animal that thinks walking into traffic is a fun hobby. Now, you might wonder why on earth scientists even bothered to test pigeons this way. The answer is kind of funny. Pigeons are cheap, easy to keep in labs, and let's be honest, no one protests when you run a few harmless experiments on pigeons. Nobody's chaining themselves to a pigeon lab shouting, "Free the pigeons!" So for decades they became the go-to test subjects for learning about animal cognition, and in the process they revealed a shocking truth. Pigeons are not stupid. In fact, pigeons are so good at pattern recognition that researchers even trained them to detect cancer in medical images. I'm not kidding. In one study, pigeons were shown microscopic images of tissue samples. Some were cancerous, some weren't. After a little training, the pigeons were able to spot cancer with accuracy rates that rivaled trained pathologists. Just let that sink in. The same bird that just pooped on your car might also be qualified to work in a hospital. But let's get back to math. Pigeons have another surprising skill. They understand the concept of ordinality. That means they know order matters. If you show them the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 in random order, they can still peck them in the right sequence. It's not just counting. It's understanding hierarchy, which means pigeons are, in a sense, doing what we humans call number lines. Without number lines, you can't do algebra. Without algebra, no physics. Without physics, no spaceships. Without spaceships, well, no pigeon would care, but still. So what's really happening inside the pigeon brain? Scientists believe pigeons, like many animals, have specialized neurons that fire in response to numerical quantities. It's not that pigeons understand math symbols like we do, but they feel quantities. They sense probabilities. They're tuned to patterns. In evolutionary terms, this makes perfect sense. For a pigeon, recognizing patterns means survival. If food usually appears after certain signals, you better be able to recognize it. If predators usually strike after certain movements, you better spot the odds. In other words, pigeon math isn't about solving equations. It's about staying alive. Now, let me add a dash of humor here. Imagine if pigeons really embraced their statistical powers. You're walking through the city, and a pigeon looks at you, tilts its head and says, "Based on the probability distribution of your clumsiness, there's a 63% chance you'll spill those fries in the next 30 seconds. We'll be waiting." Honestly, that's probably not far from reality. And while crows get all the glory for being the smart birds, pigeons might deserve more credit. Crows are dramatic geniuses, solving puzzles with flair. Pigeons are quiet nerds, sitting in the corner, running the numbers. If crows are like the loud student who always talks in class, pigeons are the quiet one who aces the exam without saying a word. Here's another twist. The math skills of pigeons have actually taught scientists about human learning. By studying how pigeons learn probability, researchers get insights into how our brains might have evolved to process chance and risk. The overlap is striking. It seems our love of statistics, or at least our constant battle with it, might come from the same ancient wiring we share with birds. So the next time you see a pigeon pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, maybe don't dismiss it. That bird could probably beat you at a probability puzzle. And if you ever find yourself in a casino surrounded by flashing lights and slot machines, just remember, a pigeon would probably walk away with more money than you. If crows are the mathematicians of the bird world, then parrots and ravens are the show-offs. Crows like to calculate quietly, keep score, and remember debts. Parrots, they want you to know how clever they are. Ravens, they're like the trickster geniuses of mythology. Half comedian, half evil mastermind. And between the two, we humans have stumbled onto some of the strangest number games in the animal kingdom. Let's start with parrots. Everyone knows parrots can mimic speech, but a few parrots go way beyond just repeating "Polly wants a cracker." There was a famous African grey named Alex, trained by the scientist Irene Pepperberg. Alex became a legend in animal cognition. Not only could he say words, but he understood concepts. He knew the difference between bigger and smaller, same and different, and yes, numbers. Alex could reliably count objects up to 6. If you put 6 blocks in front of him, he would say 6, not a random guess, not just mimicking. He actually got it right. At one point, when researchers showed him 2 groups of objects, say 3 red blocks and 2 green blocks, Alex could answer not just 3 or 2, but the total 5. A parrot doing addition. Let that sink in. While humans were arguing for centuries about how to properly write down numbers, a bird was casually adding them. And unlike us, Alex never complained about math homework. Of course, Alex also had a sense of humour. Once, when he got bored of experiments, he'd deliberately give the wrong answer, then laugh at the researchers' reactions. Imagine being a highly educated scientist with a PhD, only to be trolled by a parrot. That's peak humiliation. Now, ravens. Oh boy. If crows are clever, ravens are on another level. In folklore, they've always been the tricksters, the birds who steal, deceive, and outwit. And science has confirmed it. Ravens are ridiculously smart. They plan for the future, hide food in secret caches, and yes, they count. In one experiment, researchers tested whether ravens could keep track of quantities the way crows do. Same setup. People walking into a hideout near a raven's nest. Ravens didn't fall for the trick either. If 3 humans went in, the raven waited until all 3 came out. It knew something was off when only 2 left. That's number sense, clear as day. But ravens don't stop at counting. They also play games. Literally. Ravens have been seen in the wild sliding down snowy rooftops just for fun. They'll drop sticks mid-air and catch them again. And sometimes those games involve numbers. For example, ravens can solve puzzles that require sequential steps, like pulling on a string several times to get food. That's basically counting actions. 1, 2, 3, reward. It's not algebra, but it's the bird equivalent of following a recipe. And, just like parrots, ravens mess with humans. There are stories from researchers who say ravens deliberately cheat in experiments. They'll perform the task halfway, look at the scientist, and then refuse to finish, as if to say, "Yeah, I could do it." but I don't feel like it. It's almost performance art. What's fascinating is how both parrots and ravens take their math into social life. Parrots live in flocks, ravens in groups called unkindnesses. Yes, that's the real word, an unkindness of ravens. And in both cases, keeping track of numbers matters. If you're a raven, you need to know how many rivals are around. If you're a parrot, you need to keep track of friends and enemies in a noisy flock. Numbers aren't just abstract symbols, they're survival. Now, here's a funny thought. Imagine a parrot and a raven in a math competition. The parrot would probably ace the basic addition and subtraction, shouting out the answers with confidence. The raven, on the other hand, would sit in the corner, pretending not to care, then swoop in at the last second, solve the puzzle, and steal the prize. Two very different personalities, same mathematical toolkit. And let's not forget, these birds aren't just math whizzes. They understand concepts we thought were uniquely human. Some parrots, like Alex, could grasp the idea of zero. Some ravens can delay gratification, choosing to wait for a bigger reward rather than taking a smaller one right away. That kind of thinking requires a mental number line, comparing 1 versus 2, 2 versus 3. Without math, you can't make that decision. The real kicker is that their brains are tiny compared to ours. A raven's brain is about the size of a walnut. Yet in terms of neurons, they pack an insane amount into that space. So when a raven looks at you with those beady black eyes, it might actually be running calculations, probabilities, and plans. It's not just judging you, it's predicting you. So what do parrots and ravens teach us? That math doesn't have to look like math. For us, math means symbols on a page, calculators, or maybe terrifying memories of geometry class. For them, math is lived experience. It's how many nuts you buried, how many friends you have, how many rivals are waiting for you. It's playful, it's practical, and sometimes it's mischievous. And honestly, that's a pretty good reminder for us too. Math isn't always about getting the right answer on a test. Sometimes it's about keeping track of the world, understanding patterns, and maybe, just maybe, laughing at the scientists who underestimate you. If you thought crows and parrots were impressive, wait until you hear about the most famous math horse in history. His name was Clever Hans, and in the early 1900s he became an international superstar. People travelled from all over to see him. Why? Because Hans could supposedly do math. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, even square roots. Yes, a horse, doing square roots. Now before you imagine Hans standing in front of a chalkboard writing equations with his hoof, let me explain how it worked. His owner, a retired schoolteacher named Wilhelm von Osten, claimed that Hans could solve math problems by tapping his hoof. If you asked, what is 2 plus 3, Hans would tap 5 times. If you asked, what is the square root of 16, Hans would tap 4 times. Crowds went wild. Newspapers wrote about him. Scientists visited him. He was the original viral sensation, except instead of YouTube, it was dusty village squares in Germany. Von Osten was convinced Hans was a genius. He took him everywhere, schools, circuses, lecture halls, and every time Hans wowed the audience. Not just with math either. People swore he could spell words by tapping letters in a code, keep track of dates, and even answer yes or no questions. Imagine how humiliating it must have felt for the humans in the audience. Here they were, struggling with basic multiplication tables, while a horse casually aced math questions in front of everyone. But of course, not everyone was convinced. Some skeptics thought it was a trick. So in 1907, a panel of experts, the Hans Commission, was formed to investigate. It included psychologists, zoologists, and even military officers. They tested Hans under all kinds of conditions, different trainers, different questions, even putting up screens so Hans couldn't see the audience. And here's where things got interesting. Turns out Hans wasn't solving math problems at all. He was reading people. Whenever Hans was tapping his hoof, the human asking the question would tense up slightly as he got closer to the correct number. Maybe they leaned forward, maybe their facial muscles twitched, maybe their breathing changed. Hans, being a very observant horse, picked up on these tiny cues. When he hit the right number, he saw the human relax, and that's when he stopped tapping. So Hans wasn't a mathematician, he was a mind reader, or maybe more accurately, a body language reader. The discovery became famous in psychology. It's now called the Clever Hans effect. Basically, it means animals or even humans can give the right answer not because they understand the question, but because they're picking up subtle signals. It's why modern experiments with animals are designed so the experimenter doesn't accidentally give hints. Hans didn't know math, but he did reveal something huge about how easily we can fool ourselves. Still, let's give Hans some credit. Even if he wasn't calculating square roots, what he did was still impressive. Imagine being so good at reading human body language that you could trick scientists, journalists, and crowds of thousands for years. That takes brains. In some ways, it's even more amazing than doing arithmetic. Plenty of humans can't read social cues that well. Hans could. And you know what? Von Osten never stopped believing in his horse. Even after the commission exposed the truth, he insisted Hans was genuinely talented. And maybe, in his own way, Hans was. He wasn't a math genius. He was a genius at understanding people, which, if you think about it, is a skill that can take you just as far as knowing algebra. The story of clever Hans spread around the world. He became a symbol of both hope and caution. Hope, because people loved the idea of a horse who could do math. Caution, because he reminded scientists to be careful about wishful thinking. It's so easy to see what you want to see. Von Osten wanted a math horse, so he believed he had one. The audience wanted a miracle, so they saw one. Hans just wanted oats, so he tapped his hoof until the food arrived. Everybody won, in a way. But here's the funny part. Even after the hoax was exposed, Hans was still popular. People kept visiting him, not to see him do math, but just to see him. He had become a celebrity, the horse who fooled the world. And honestly, that's a pretty good legacy. Most of us will never achieve that level of fame. Clever Hans will always be remembered in psychology textbooks, animal cognition studies, and even pop culture references, all without solving a single equation. So what do we take away from this story? That math isn't always what it looks like. Sometimes animals surprise us in ways we don't expect. Sometimes we humans get so excited about the idea of animal intelligence that we trick ourselves. And sometimes the truth is even stranger than the myth. A horse who can't add but can read facial twitches might actually be more impressive than a horse who can add. And think about this. Hans showed us that animals pay much closer attention to us than we realize. Every time you interact with your dog, cat, or horse, they're reading you. Not just your words, but your posture, your eyes, your movements. They notice the details you don't even know you're giving away. Maybe your pet isn't doing math, but it's solving a different kind of equation, the equation of you. So we've just met Clever Hans, the horse who fooled half of Europe into thinking he was a math genius. But here's the twist. Just because Hans wasn't secretly solving equations doesn't mean horses are hopeless with numbers. In fact, modern science shows that horses still have some real mathematical skills, not calculus level, but enough to surprise us. Let's start with something simple. Horses are really good at recognizing when something doesn't add up. Imagine you have a group of apples. You show a horse 2 apples, then add 2 more. That's 4 apples. Now secretly remove 1 before the horse gets to eat them. The horse notices. It stares longer, hesitates, maybe even nudges around looking for the missing apple. That's called violation of expectation. Basically, the horse is running a mental equation, 2 plus 2 equals 4. When the outcome doesn't match, it gets confused, which is exactly what you and I do when we check our bank account and the math doesn't add up. Another fun fact, horses can distinguish between different quantities. If you put 2 buckets in front of a horse, one with 3 carrots and one with 5, most of the time the horse will go for the 5. Not always. Sometimes horses get distracted or just don't care, but overall they lean toward more is better. That means they aren't just acting randomly, they have a basic sense of comparison. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Horses also seem to keep track of group sizes. Picture this, a horse in a stable is separated from its buddies. You release some of the herd back into the paddock. If the horse knows it has 3 close friends, it won't settle down until all 3 are back. If only 2 return, the horse stays restless. It knows 1 is missing. That's not superstition, that's number sense. And honestly, it's a little heartwarming. Horses don't just notice numbers, they notice friends. Researchers even tested this with unfamiliar horses. When given a choice between joining a group of 2 or a group of 4, horses usually picked the larger group. More companions means more safety. It's herd logic. But herd logic is math. It's the equation of survival. Bigger number equals better odds. And let's not forget memory. Horses have long memories, not just for people and places, but also for amounts. Some experiments suggest that horses can remember how many treats they've already received. Give a horse 3 sugar cubes, then try to cheat it by pretending to give a fourth but actually giving nothing. The horse will look at you like, "Excuse me, human, I think you owe me," which is basically the equine version of checking your receipt at the grocery store. Now, I know what you might be thinking. If horses are this good at numbers, why don't we see more horse geniuses like clever Hans? The answer is, Hans wasn't a genius, he was reading people. Real horse math is quieter, subtler, and more about survival than performance. Horses aren't show-offs like parrots. They don't sit there trying to impress us with their skills. They just use math when it matters. Food, friends, safety, the basics of life. And actually that makes sense. Think about how horses live. They're prey animals. Their main job is to stay alive by noticing threats. For them, math isn't about solving puzzles on a chalkboard. It's about keeping track of how many companions are nearby, how many predators are circling, or how much food is available. It's survival math. No frills, no drama, just the essentials. But still, it's impressive. One researcher put it this way: horses aren't doing symbolic math like humans, but they definitely have what we might call quantity discrimination, which is just a fancy way of saying they know the difference between more and less. And once you think about it, that's the foundation of all mathematics. Before algebra, before geometry, before calculus, you have to understand more versus less. Horses have that. And here's something funny. Even though horses don't perform math tricks anymore because researchers are careful not to fall for the clever Hans effect, horse owners still swear their animals know more than science admits. Some say their horses can count jumps on an obstacle course. Others say their horses keep track of how many times they've been fed. Now, are these scientific studies? Not really. But as every horse owner will tell you, horses are watching, they're paying attention, and they definitely know when you've shortchanged them on hay. It makes you wonder if horses had the patience to sit in classrooms. Would they learn formal math? Maybe not calculus, but at least counting. We'll probably never know, but one thing is clear. Horses are not clueless. They're observant, social, and surprisingly mathematical in their own quiet way. So maybe clever Hans wasn't a fraud after all. Not a fraud in the sense of being completely fake. He was proof that horses are deeply tuned into humans, reading signals we don't even realize we give off. And while he wasn't calculating square roots, he still revealed something remarkable. Horses notice numbers. They notice patterns, and in their own way they're keeping score. Next time you see a horse out in a field, don't just think of it as a big grass-munching animal. Think of it as a quiet mathematician, running calculations you'll never see. And maybe, just maybe, silently judging you for losing count of how many carrots you promised. When we think of sheep, cows and goats, mathematics is usually the last thing that comes to mind. Sheep are famous for following the crowd. Cows are famous for chewing slowly and staring at you like you're the weird one. Goats are famous for climbing on literally anything, including cars, cliffs, and occasionally other goats. None of them exactly scream hidden math genius, and yet the farmyard is full of quiet arithmetic. Let's start with sheep. For thousands of years, shepherds have worked with flocks, and they noticed something important. Sheep keep track. A ewe with 3 lambs knows if one goes missing. You can swap out one lamb for another, and she'll notice. She's not just sniffing, she's counting, or at least recognizing the difference between 2 and 3. To a mother sheep, numbers mean survival. If one lamb disappears, that's not just subtraction, that's danger. Modern experiments back this up. Researchers tested lambs by showing them different numbers of objects, say 2 versus 3. Even very young lambs showed preference for larger groups. Bigger number meant more safety. Sheep, it turns out, aren't just blindly following the herd. They're doing calculations. More bodies around me equals fewer chances I'll be the unlucky one eaten by a wolf. Now cows don't usually get much credit for intelligence. They stand in fields, they chew grass, they moo occasionally, and that's about it. But when scientists started looking more closely, they found cows are actually pretty good at distinguishing numbers. In one study, cows could tell the difference between small quantities of food, show them 2 piles of apples, 3 in one pile, 4 in the other, and the cows gravitated toward the bigger pile. That might sound simple, but it shows cows are sensitive to amounts. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Grazing animals have to decide constantly where to go. Is that patch of grass thicker than the other? Is there more food over there? Quantity matters. But cows also show number awareness socially. Herd animals like cows and sheep notice when individuals are missing. Farmers have long reported that cows get agitated if a familiar member of the herd is removed. Some studies suggest they can even recognize when the group is smaller than it should be. So while cows may look blankly at you with big brown eyes, inside their brains a little math engine is running, keeping track of who's in the group and who's not. And then we have goats. Our goats, the clowns of the barnyard. While sheep follow, goats test boundaries. They climb walls, butt heads, and nibble things that should never be nibbled. But behind the chaos, there's logic. Goats also show number sense. In experiments, goats chose larger quantities of food when presented with two options. Like sheep and cows, they have the survival equation. More food equals better choice. But goats go one step further. They're curious problem solvers. Some tests gave goats puzzles, like figuring out how to open a box for food. Not only did the goats succeed, they remembered the solution months later. That memory included keeping track of steps, which is, in its own way, a kind of counting. Farmers have known this for centuries, even without experiments. Old stories talk about goats who could count their kids and find them when separated, or cows who refused to settle until all the calves were back. It wasn't math homework, but it was farmyard arithmetic, keeping score in the only way that mattered. It's funny to think about, but in many ways, early humans learned math side by side with these animals. Shepherds used tally sticks to track flocks, but the sheep themselves were also tracking their young. Farmers counted cows, but the cows were also counting each other. It's almost like math grew out of this shared relationship. Humans formalized numbers with marks and symbols. Animals kept it instinctive, but no less real. Here's something else. These animals may not understand numbers abstractly, but they know fairness. Experiments show that goats and cows notice unequal treatment. If one animal gets more food than the other, they react. That sense of fairness requires some kind of mental math comparing what I got versus what they got. Sound familiar? It's the same math that fuels sibling rivalries at dinner tables everywhere. Of course, we shouldn't exaggerate. No one's claiming cows are secretly calculating square roots while staring into space, but their world is filled with numbers in a practical sense. How many calves are here? How many companions do I have? How much food is in that pile compared to this one? That's arithmetic, not written on paper, but lived in fields. And honestly, that's the kind of math most of us use daily. You might not touch calculus after school, but you'll still count your change, compare prices, or keep track of how many cookies are left in the jar. Sheep, cows, and goats are doing the same thing, just with grass, safety, and survival instead of cookies. So next time you drive past a pasture and see animals standing around, don't assume nothing is happening in their heads. Quietly and visibly, they're running numbers. They're solving the math of life. And while it might not impress in a classroom, it's impressive where it counts. Monkeys have always fascinated humans. They look a bit like us. They act a bit like us, and sometimes they embarrass us by being better at things we think only humans should be good at. Case in point, math. Now, before you picture a monkey wearing tiny glasses and balancing an abacus like some kind of furry accountant, let me explain. When I say monkeys on the abacus, I mean that researchers have actually trained monkeys to use number systems, sometimes even tools to keep track of amounts. And once you dive into the studies, you realize something humbling. Monkeys are pretty good at it. Let's start with a basic observation. Monkeys, like many other animals, have a built-in sense of numbers. Even without training, they can tell the difference between small amounts. Show a monkey 2 piles of fruit, say 2 bananas versus 3, and it almost always goes for the larger pile. That's simple enough. But with training, monkeys can go way beyond this. One famous series of experiments involved rhesus monkeys. Scientists showed them computer screens with numbers of dots. The monkeys had to pick the correct symbol or press the right button that matched the number. At first, the monkeys were just guessing. But after some training, and of course banana rewards, they started getting it right. They learned not just to recognize numbers, but to understand the order of numbers. 2 comes before 3, 3 comes before 4. That's the beginning of a number line. Now, once you have a number line, you can do math. And guess what? Monkeys did. In some experiments, monkeys were able to add small numbers. For example, if they saw 2 dots, then another 2 dots, then They expected 4. If the answer didn't match, they showed surprise, just like humans would if the math didn't check out. That's arithmetic in action. And here's where it gets even cooler. In Japan, scientists trained monkeys to use an actual abacus. Yes, the wooden counting tool with beads. The monkeys learned to slide beads across to represent numbers. They weren't solving algebra, but they were using the abacus to keep track of quantities. Think about that. Humans invented the abacus thousands of years ago, and now monkeys were casually picking it up. It's like we discovered that our evolutionary cousins were just waiting for someone to hand them a calculator. But maybe the most shocking results came from memory tests. In one experiment, chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys were shown numbers on a screen for just a fraction of a second. The numbers disappeared, and the monkeys had to tap the locations in the correct order. Some of the monkeys not only got it right, they were faster and more accurate than human college students who were tested on the same task. Yes, you heard that correctly. A monkey outperformed humans in a number memory game. Imagine failing a math quiz and the professor says, "Well, the good news is, the monkey aced it." That's a blow to the ego. So why are monkeys so good at this? The answer lies in their brains. Like us, primates have specialized neurons for recognizing quantities. Their brains are wired for numbers. The difference is, humans developed language and symbols to build skyscrapers of mathematics on top of this wiring. Monkeys, meanwhile, stuck to the basics, but the foundation is the same. When a monkey sees 3 bananas, the same type of brain cells fire as when you see 3 apples. The math instinct is shared. What's even more fascinating is that monkeys can generalize. If they learn that 3 + 2 = 5 in one context, they can apply the rule in another. That's huge. It means they're not just memorizing patterns, they're understanding principles. In psychology, that's called transference. In monkey terms, it's called "I get more bananas if I do this right." Of course, monkeys also add their own personality to math. Some monkeys are patient, careful counters. Others are chaotic little gremlins who'd rather smash the equipment. But overall, they show a surprising level of focus when numbers are involved, especially if rewards are on the line. It turns out, the secret to motivating a monkey to do math is the same as motivating a human child: snacks. Here's one more fun story. In one lab, monkeys were trained to recognize the symbols for numbers 0 through 9 on a keyboard. Eventually, some monkeys started stringing numbers together to ask for larger rewards. For example, pressing 7 instead of 3 meant more treats. That's not just recognizing numbers, that's using them strategically. You could almost say they were negotiating with the humans. Imagine walking into a lab and a monkey types 10 at you like it's demanding 10 grapes. At that point, who's really in charge? So what does all this tell us? Monkeys don't just live in the jungle or sit in zoos throwing food at tourists. They are running mental equations. They know more and less. They know order. They can add, subtract, and sometimes even beat us at memory-based math games. In other words, math is not a uniquely human superpower. It's a shared inheritance from our evolutionary cousins. Of course, no monkey is going to publish a math textbook. They're not out there proving theorems or building rocket ships. But their skills remind us that the roots of math go deep, far before humans started scribbling symbols. Numbers weren't invented in dusty Mesopotamian temples. They were already alive in the forests, in the trees, in the playful hands of monkeys. When people say humans are the smartest animals on Earth, they usually add, well, except maybe dolphins, or elephants, or chimps. And when it comes to math, chimpanzees deserve a special place on that shortlist. Because believe it or not, there are cases where chimps aren't just good at math, they're better than us. Let me tell you about a chimpanzee named Ayumu. Ayumu lives in Japan and has become a legend in animal cognition research. His specialty? Number memory. Scientists gave him a task that sounds simple but is surprisingly tough. Numbers from 1 to 9 would flash on a screen, scattered in random spots. The numbers only appeared for a fraction of a second before being covered by white squares. The chimp's job was to touch the squares in the correct order, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9. Sounds easy, right? Wrong. When humans tried the same task, they failed, miserably. College students, trained volunteers, none of them could consistently get it right, but Ayumu nailed it, over and over again. In fact, he was faster and more accurate than the humans. Scientists eventually had to admit something that no math teacher ever wants to say out loud. A chimpanzee had better short-term number memory than most of us. How? Well, one theory is that chimps never developed language in the same way humans did, so their brains stayed sharper at raw visual memory. When numbers appear on a screen, a chimp brain can snapshot the whole thing instantly, while our brains get bogged down trying to name the numbers in our heads. The result? Humans are slower, chimps are lightning fast, which is honestly both impressive and a little embarrassing. Imagine spending years in school only to be outperformed by a chimp on a number test. And it's not just Ayumu. Other chimps have shown similar abilities. In experiments, chimpanzees consistently prove they can understand order, quantity, and even simple addition. For example, if you show a chimp 2 bananas and then add another one, the chimp expects 3. If you show 2 grapes and then another 2, the chimp expects 4. When the outcome doesn't match, the chimp gets confused, exactly like we do when our math doesn't check out. Chimps have even been trained to recognize written numerals. They can point to 5 when asked, or choose between 7 and 3 for the bigger number. Some chimps can count up to 20. 20! That's farther than most toddlers get before they start making mistakes. It's enough to make you wonder, if chimps had schools, would they be handing out math homework too? Here's where it gets funny. Chimps don't just use math in experiments, they use it in their daily lives. In the wild, chimpanzees hunt monkeys in coordinated groups. Researchers notice they don't just charge in randomly. They seem to calculate group sizes. If there aren't enough chimps to surround their prey, they don't bother hunting. That's strategy. That's numbers in action. It's not algebra, but it's good enough to decide whether dinner is worth the effort. Another example. Chimps use math when it comes to fairness. In experiments, 2 chimps are given different rewards for the same task. One gets a grape, the other gets a cucumber slice. The one with the cucumber notices the inequality and throws a fit. That's not just jealousy, that's math. They're running the equation. Same work should equal same reward. Sound familiar? It's the exact same math your brain does when you see your coworker getting paid more for doing the same job. And let's not forget memory span. Chimps remember not only numbers on a screen, but also the amounts of food they've received. If you try to trick a chimp by giving fewer treats than promised, it doesn't work. They know what they're owed. One researcher joked that chimps might make better accountants than humans, mainly because they don't lose track of the numbers. So, are chimps smarter than us? Not quite. Humans still have the edge when it comes to abstract math, symbols, and higher reasoning. No chimp is out there solving calculus equations. But when it comes to raw number sense, speed, and memory, chimps sometimes have us beat. They remind us that math is not just something we invented in dusty classrooms. It's a deep, ancient ability wired into brains long before humans wrote anything down. The story of Ayumu and other chimps shows that intelligence is not one size fits all. We're great at certain things. Chimps are great at others. Our brains sacrificed some raw visual memory for language and abstract thought. Chimps held on to that raw talent, which lets them flash through number puzzles like mental athletes. It makes you wonder, if chimps had developed language and writing, would they have built their own version of math? Would they be sitting under trees teaching little chimps how to count? Maybe. Or maybe they'd just use their skills to negotiate for more bananas. Honestly, that's not a bad use of math either. So the next time you're fumbling with your grocery bill or trying to remember a phone number, just know, somewhere out there, a chimp could probably do it faster. And while that might bruise our human pride, it also connects us to something beautiful. Math isn't just ours, it's part of the shared toolkit of life, stretching across species. When you think of baboons, maybe you imagine big teeth, loud calls, or that one baboon from The Lion King who seemed to be both wise and a little unhinged. But behind the fur and the dramatic personalities, baboons have a surprising skill set. They're not just about intimidation or stealing snacks from tourists, they also have a head for numbers and logic, and sometimes they understand more than they should. Let's start with something basic. Baboons, like other primates, can distinguish between quantities. Put 2 piles of food in front of them, say 3 peanuts versus 7, and they'll almost always grab the larger pile. But researchers soon discovered this was only scratching the surface. Baboons can also understand order. For example, if shown a sequence of symbols, they can learn that one comes before the other. That's called serial learning, and it's the backbone of both language and math. Without order, you don't have sentences, and you don't have equations. In one famous study, baboons were taught to recognize abstract patterns on a screen. They had to figure out whether shapes appeared in the correct sequence. At first it seemed impossible, but over time the baboons not only learnt the sequences, they started to generalize. They could apply the same rule to new shapes they'd never seen before. That's logic. That's not just reacting, that's reasoning. And here's where it gets funny. Sometimes the baboons performed better than human children given the same tasks. That's right. In some experiments, baboons showed a stronger grasp of order and logic than preschoolers, which means somewhere out there a baboon could walk into kindergarten, ace the sequencing test, and then steal your lunch. But wait, it gets even more interesting. Baboons also show an understanding of probability. In one experiment, researchers put food rewards into two containers. One had a high ratio of treats to non-treats, and the other had a lower ratio. When baboons picked a container, they consistently went for the one with the better odds of success. In other words, they weren't just guessing, they were evaluating chances like tiny furry gamblers with built-in calculators. And if you think this sounds like pigeons and their probability tricks, you're right. But baboons take it further. They can weigh risks. They'll sometimes choose the smaller pile of food if it offers more security. That's basically risk management. Somewhere an economist is sweating because a baboon just made the same decision they did, but faster and with fewer spreadsheets. Now, logic doesn't stop at numbers. Baboons also grasp patterns in social life. They live in complex groups with hierarchies, alliances, and drama that could rival any soap opera. And to navigate that drama, they need to keep track of relationships. Who's dominant? Who's allied with whom? Who's likely to back you up in a fight? That requires mental bookkeeping. Numbers, ranks, probabilities. It's like baboons are constantly running a political simulation in their heads. There's even evidence that baboons understand the concept of same and different. In one experiment, they were shown pairs of symbols and had to figure out whether they matched or not. Over time, they got it. That might sound small, but it's huge. Recognizing sameness and difference is a foundation of logic, the kind of reasoning that eventually leads to algebra, coding, and maybe even philosophy. Of course, baboons add their own chaotic flair to math. They don't just solve problems, they sometimes cheat. In group settings, researchers found baboons would watch others, then copy the right answer instead of solving it themselves. It's a kind of shortcut, and it shows something important. Baboons aren't just learning rules, they're strategizing. They know the fastest way to get the treat is sometimes to let someone else do the math. And honestly, that's a strategy plenty of us used in school too. Now, I know what you're wondering. If baboons are this logical, why aren't they running the world? The answer is simple. They don't care about building skyscrapers or writing textbooks. Their math is practical. It's about food, safety, and social life. They're not sitting under a tree proving the Pythagorean theorem. They're figuring out which tree has more fruit and which rival group is smaller and easier to chase away. But in their world, that's all the math they need. Still, it's impressive. When you zoom out, you realize baboons are doing something extraordinary. They're bridging the gap between instinct and reasoning. They're showing us that math isn't just about equations, it's about thinking logically, weighing options, and recognizing order. In other words, they're doing the kind of math we humans use every day, whether it's planning our schedules, comparing prices, or avoiding traffic. So next time you see a picture of a baboon with its dramatic mane and intense eyes, don't just think scary monkey. Think logician, think gambler, think political strategist with a built-in calculator. Because behind those eyes is a mind running calculations you never expected. Humans like to believe we invented money. Coins, bills, credit cards, crypto, these are all supposed to be our brilliant ideas. But then along come the capuchin monkeys, and they prove that the basic concept of money isn't so uniquely human after all. Give a monkey some tokens and a chance to trade them for treats, and suddenly you've got Wall Street in the jungle. It all started with an experiment in the early 2000s at Yale University. Researchers wanted to see if capuchin monkeys, small, clever primates with curious little faces, could understand the idea of currency, so they gave the monkeys shiny silver tokens, kind of like casino chips. The tokens didn't mean anything at first, but the monkeys quickly learned they could exchange them for food. Suddenly, those little pieces of metal had value. Money was born in monkey society. At first, it was simple. 1 token for a slice of apple, 1 token for a grape. The monkeys caught on fast. They started hoarding tokens, protecting them, even fighting over them. Sound familiar? It didn't take long before the researchers realized they had basically created a tiny monkey economy. But then things got wild. The researchers introduced choices. Sometimes one vendor offered 2 grapes for a token. Sometimes only 1. Sometimes a deal seemed better, but wasn't. And the monkeys? They reacted exactly like humans do. They preferred bargains. They avoided bad deals. They even showed what economists call loss aversion. If they thought they were losing out, they got upset. One researcher described it like watching little furry day traders throwing tantrums when the stock market dropped. And just when you think it can't get any stranger, one day, a monkey stole a pile of tokens. Instead of rushing to buy food, the monkey handed a token to another monkey in exchange for, well, let's call it a social favor. Yes, the very first recorded case of monkey prostitution. The researchers were shocked. The newspapers had a field day, and the monkeys just carried on as if they'd invented Las Vegas. But the important part is this. The Capuchins weren't just playing with shiny objects. They were using abstract symbols to represent value. That's the heart of economics. It's the same leap humans made thousands of years ago when we decided shells, stones, or bits of metal could stand in for goats, wheat, or work. The monkeys didn't just understand more food is better. They understood this thing represents food. That's a huge cognitive step. And it didn't stop there. Researchers also tested how monkeys reacted to risky bets. For example, a token might buy 1 grape for sure, or it might buy a 50-50 chance at 2 grapes or nothing. The monkeys had preferences. Some played it safe, some took risks. In other words, monkeys had personalities as investors, which is hilarious and also a little terrifying. Imagine a stock market run entirely by capuchins. Honestly, could it be worse than the real one? Even more amazing, the monkeys displayed something like fairness calculations. If 2 monkeys paid the same token but one got a grape and the other got cucumber, the cucumber monkey often got angry and refused to participate. This is the same fairness math that chimpanzees showed earlier, but now combined with tokens, it looked even closer to human economic behavior. They weren't just reacting to food, they were comparing costs and outcomes. Here's a fun way to think about it. The researchers expected to teach monkeys about money. Instead, the monkeys ended up teaching researchers about human behavior, because the way capuchins reacted to gains, losses, bargains, and unfair trades was eerily similar to the way we react. It suggested that the roots of economic behavior go much deeper than human civilization. They're built into the primate brain. And of course, the monkeys also made mistakes. They gambled poorly sometimes. They hoarded uselessly. They even stole from each other. But again, does that really sound so different from human economies? Banks collapse, markets crash, people panic buy toilet paper. If you squint a little, it's all the same math. What this shows is that money isn't just about numbers. It's about trust, symbols, and relationships. The monkeys weren't solving equations, they were solving social equations. Who do I trust? Who gives me a better deal? How do I get the most with what I have? That's economics in its rawest form. And maybe that's why this experiment became so famous. It wasn't just funny, it was profound. It suggested that the building blocks of human society, trade, currency, even greed, aren't uniquely ours. They've been hiding in monkey brains all along. So next time you pull out your wallet or tap your credit card, take a second to imagine a little capuchin monkey doing the same thing with a shiny token. Somewhere deep inside, the math is the same. We're all just trying to turn symbols into bananas. When you picture a mathematician, you probably don't think of a fish. Fish seem like they're just swimming around aimlessly, blowing bubbles and occasionally starring in Disney movies. But here's the twist. Even fish can count. Not in the sense of doing long division or balancing your taxes, but in the survival sense. Because in the underwater world, knowing the difference between a few and a lot can mean life or death. Let's start with schools of fish. Why do fish swim in big groups? Safety. The more fish there are, the harder it is for predators to single one out. It's the classic safety in numbers strategy. But here's the kicker. Fish don't just swim randomly into groups. They actually choose. In experiments, researchers put a fish in a tank with 2 different schools to join. One group had, say, 5 fish. The other had 10. Almost every time, the lone fish chose to join the larger group. Bigger group equals better odds of survival. That's math, fish style. Now some of you might think, well, maybe the fish just saw a bigger blob and swam toward it. Fair point. But scientists tested that. They controlled for size, spacing and movement. And still, fish consistently chose the larger number. Not just big blob versus small blob, but actual numerical difference. Some species can even distinguish between small ratios like 4 versus 5. That's sharper than you'd expect for a creature with the attention span of, well, a goldfish. Speaking of goldfish, yes, even they show number sense. Researchers trained goldfish to recognize symbols representing different amounts. For example, one symbol might mean 2 pellets of food, another might mean 4. The fish learned to swim toward the symbol that gave the bigger reward, and they didn't just memorize, they generalized to new symbols, which basically means your pet goldfish might secretly be better at simple math than your cousin who failed algebra. And it's not just about food. Some fish use numbers in courtship. Male fish in certain species try to impress females by building little nests or doing dance-like displays. Females prefer males that repeat their moves more times. The female fish, without counting out loud, seem to know the difference between 5 and 10, which means somewhere in a coral reef, fish are basically using arithmetic as a dating app. Here's another fun one. Guppies have been tested for their ability to recognize numerical differences. When given a choice between swimming toward 2 objects versus 3, guppies consistently preferred the larger number if it meant more food or more companions, and when researchers pushed the limits, like comparing 7 to 8, the guppies struggled, but still showed some ability. That's impressive for an animal whose brain is smaller than a pea. But perhaps the most mind-blowing studies involve zebrafish. Scientists trained zebrafish to distinguish between groups of dots on a screen. The fish learned to swim toward the correct group to get food. Over time, they showed not only that they could tell the difference between, say, 3 and 4, but also that they could apply this knowledge in new contexts. They weren't just memorizing, they were actually counting. Now, let's not get carried away. Fish aren't solving quadratic equations under the sea. They're not running stock markets in coral reefs. Their math is basic, but it's also universal. It's the math of survival. How many predators are there? How many friends do I have nearby? How many times do I need to waggle my fins before I get noticed by a potential mate? These are real calculations, and fish are doing them every day. What makes this fascinating is that it pushes the origins of number sense even further back in evolution. Birds, primates, horses, sure, we can accept that they have math skills, but fish split off from our evolutionary line hundreds of millions of years ago. If they have number sense too, it means this ability is not a late invention. It's ancient, deeply embedded in the wiring of animal brains. And let's be honest, it's also a little funny, because while we humans like to think of ourselves as the mathematical species, a guppy might be quietly out there doing the same kind of math you use to decide which checkout line at the grocery store is shorter. You and a guppy, same brainwave. It also makes you wonder how much we underestimate the creatures around us. A fish may look blank-faced, swimming in circles, but in its own quiet way, it's solving equations of risk and reward. That's math, that's survival, and that's humbling. So next time someone says you have the memory of a goldfish, maybe take it as a compliment. Goldfish can recognize numbers, they can tell differences, and they can even be trained to solve simple problems, which means they might deserve a little more respect than we give them. If you ever needed proof that math is everywhere in nature, you don't have to look at the stars or the ocean. You just need to look inside a beehive. Bees, with their tiny buzzing bodies and even tinier brains, are some of the greatest natural mathematicians on Earth. They don't carry calculators, they don't write equations, but somehow they've mastered geometry, optimization, and even a little counting, all while being, well, bees. Let's start with the obvious, the honeycomb. Everyone's seen the pattern, perfect hexagons, fitting together without gaps. But have you ever wondered why hexagons? Bees could have chosen circles or squares or triangles, but no, they went with hexagons, and it turns out hexagons are mathematically the best choice. Here's why. Imagine you're trying to store honey. You need cells that hold the maximum amount of honey, but you also want to use the least amount of wax to build the walls. Circles waste space. Squares and triangles work, but they don't hold as much volume for the same perimeter. Hexagons, they're the sweet spot. They fill space perfectly, no gaps, no wasted material, and maximum efficiency. It's like bees solved an engineering problem that mathematicians didn't formally crack until centuries later. In fact, this problem, The honeycomb conjecture was only proven by mathematicians in the 1990s. Bees, meanwhile, had been proving it every day for millions of years. Somewhere in the hive, bees are probably laughing at us. Congrats on discovering what we've been doing since the dinosaur days. But bees aren't just geometric geniuses. They also count. Yes, bees can actually keep track of numbers. Researchers have shown that bees can recognize small quantities, like distinguishing between 2 flowers and 3. In one study, bees were trained to associate a specific number of shapes with a sugary reward. Show them the right number, and they'd fly straight to the treat. Show them the wrong number, and they'd skip it. Bees consistently got it right, which means somewhere inside that little insect brain, numbers are being processed. And it gets crazier. Bees seem to understand the concept of zero. Zero, the number that gave ancient mathematicians headaches for centuries. In experiments, bees were trained to recognize less than relationships like 2 is less than 3. Then scientists showed them a blank card representing nothing. The bees treated it as less than 1. That means they weren't just seeing no shapes, they were categorizing nothing as its own value. Congratulations, bees, you just cracked one of the hardest concepts in math. But wait, there's more. Bees also use math in navigation. When a bee finds a good patch of flowers, it doesn't just rush back to the hive screaming food. Instead, it performs the famous waggle dance. By wiggling in a figure-8 pattern, the bee communicates both the direction and the distance of the food source. The angle of the waggle tells the direction relative to the sun. The length of the waggle tells the distance. It's basically trigonometry, danced out on a tiny stage for an audience of bees. Now, think about that. A bee with a brain smaller than a grain of rice is performing trigonometry through interpretive dance. Meanwhile, humans need entire GPS satellites to do the same thing. Who's the real genius here? Even the way bees decide on a new hive location involves math. When a swarm needs a new home, scout bees go out to find possible sites. Each scout comes back and dances for their chosen spot. The better the site, the more enthusiastic the dance. Other bees observe, compare, and eventually reach a consensus based on the votes. It's like democratic math, with dances instead of ballots. Somehow, this process leads to the best choice almost every time. Bees are literally running voting algorithms without spreadsheets. And here's a fun image. Imagine if humans solved problems the same way. Instead of elections, we'd all just gather in a big hall and wiggle until we reached consensus. Honestly, might not be worse. The point is, bees don't just stumble into math. They use it deliberately, constantly, in ways that put us to shame. Hexagons, zero, trigonometry, probability. They've got it all, and they do it without ever writing a single number. Which raises an interesting question. If math is really this universal, maybe it's less about being human and more about being alive. So the next time you see a bee buzzing around your picnic, don't swat at it. Respect it. That little insect might have a better grasp of geometry than most of us who suffered through high school math. It's not just looking for sugar, it's living out ancient equations passed down through evolution. Let's be honest, if you asked most people whether their dog or cat can do math, the answer would probably be laughter. Dogs are too busy sniffing everything, and cats are too busy ignoring you. But the truth is, our pets have a surprising relationship with numbers. Not in the sense of solving equations, but in the sense of keeping track, counting treats, noticing when something's missing, and yes, even doing a little math of their own. Let's start with dogs. If you've ever fed a dog, you already know they can count, at least when it comes to treats. Give a dog 2 biscuits one day, then only 1 the next, and you'll get a very unimpressed stare. Dogs notice. In fact, researchers tested this in controlled experiments. Dogs were shown a set number of treats, say 2, and then watched as more were added. When the math didn't add up, like if 2 treats were shown but only 1 appeared, the dogs stared longer, hesitated, and acted confused, just like humans do when the numbers don't check out. That's called numerical expectation, and it's a sign of basic arithmetic. Dogs also understand fairness. If 2 dogs are doing the same trick but only 1 gets rewarded, the other one will protest. Maybe it refuses to do the trick again. Maybe it sulks. Maybe it barks at the unfair human. That requires a comparison. I did the same thing but got less, which is math. Dogs are basically running emotional spreadsheets in their heads. And it's not just food. Dogs can count family members. Some owners have told stories of dogs waiting at the door until everyone is home. If one person is missing, the dog doesn't settle down. It knows the difference between 4 people and 3 people. And when the missing person walks in, the dog finally relaxes. That's not coincidence, that's counting. Now let's switch to cats. Cats are complicated. They don't exactly perform on command, so testing them in experiments is a nightmare. Researchers will set up elaborate studies only for the cat to walk away and lick its paw in the corner. But when scientists do manage to test them, cats show some surprising number skills too. Like dogs, cats notice when something is missing. Put 3 toys in front of a cat, then quietly remove one while it's not looking. The cat will often stare at the space where the missing toy should be, as if trying to do the math. Cats may not care about pleasing you, but they care about their own stuff, and if their stuff doesn't add up, they notice. Cats also seem to use numbers when hunting. Studies suggest they can estimate the number of prey in a group. If there are too many, they might back off. If there are fewer, they're more likely to pounce. That's survival arithmetic. Is the effort worth it? Cats are basically running cost-benefit analyses, even if they'd never admit it. And then there's the classic story every cat owner knows, the cat that keeps track of how many times you've fed it. You think you've already given the cat breakfast. The cat thinks otherwise. Who's right? Well, the cat certainly acts like it's running its own calculations. I should have had 2 meals by now. You've only given me 1. Pay up. Dogs beg because they're hopeful. Cats demand because they've done the math. Some scientists even suggest cats understand very small numbers, instinctively, like the difference between 1 and 2. And honestly, that's probably enough for them. 1 mouse versus 2 mice is all the arithmetic a cat really needs. What's fascinating about both dogs and cats is how much of their math is tied to social life. Dogs use numbers to keep track of fairness, family members, and routines. Cats use numbers to track resources, hunting opportunities, and meals. Neither one is sitting down to do geometry, but both are quietly running calculations that keep their world predictable. And maybe that's why we find their behavior so funny, because deep down we recognize ourselves in it. When a dog looks betrayed because you gave its sibling more treats, it's doing the same math we do when someone else gets a bigger slice of cake. When a cat sits on the counter glaring at you because the food bowl isn't full, it's doing the same math you do when your paycheck doesn't stretch as far as it should. So the next time you look at your pet, remember, they're not just cute faces, they're tiny mathematicians in fur coats. They're keeping score, they're running equations, and they're definitely judging you if you mess up the numbers. So far, we've seen birds that can count, horses that can track missing apples, monkeys that can gamble, chimps that can out-memorize us, and even bees that basically do geometry while dancing. It's tempting to shout, animals are mathematicians too. But hold on a second, there's a deeper question here. Do animals really understand math, or are they just following instincts that happen to look mathematical? This is where things get tricky, because understanding is different from doing. For example, if you train a parrot to say 5 when it sees 5 objects, does it actually understand the idea of 5, or is it just mimicking a sound that leads to a reward? That's the big debate in animal cognition. Is it real math, or just a clever trick? Humans like to think our math is special. We use symbols, we can imagine infinity. We can prove theorems that exist only in abstract worlds. Animals don't do that, at least not as far as we know. But on the other hand, a lot of the math we humans actually use day to day isn't abstract at all. It's practical. It's about knowing more versus less, fair versus unfair, safe versus dangerous. And in that sense, animals are doing the same thing. Some philosophers argue that animals have proto-mathematics, the raw foundation of math before it gets dressed up in symbols and equations. Think of it like scaffolding. We humans built skyscrapers of algebra and calculus on top of it, but the scaffolding itself has been there all along. When a crow notices that one hunter is still hiding in the bushes, that's proto-math. When a dog realizes its sibling got more treats, that's proto-math. They're not writing it down, but they're definitely living it. But then comes the big question. Does it matter if animals understand math in the way we define it? For survival, no. A chimp doesn't need to philosophize about what numbers mean. It just needs to know 3 bananas are better than 2. A fish doesn't care about the abstract beauty of 0. It just knows that swimming with 10 friends is safer than swimming with 3. In a way, their math is purer than ours. It's stripped down to its essence. Numbers as life and death. Still, there are hints that some animals grasp more than instinct. Take the bees who recognized zero. Zero is not just survival math, it's an abstract concept. Or Alex the parrot, who not only counted but understood same and different. Or Ayumu the chimp, who remembered number sequences faster than human college students. These examples suggest animals aren't just reacting, they're reasoning, they're using logic, not just reflexes. This leads to another philosophical question. Is human math really as different as we think? Sure, we can do calculus, but how many people actually do calculus outside of school? Most of us spend our lives using math in the same way animals do. Budgeting, keeping track, noticing when something doesn't add up. Maybe the line between human math and animal math isn't as wide as we imagine. Maybe it's just a matter of scale. There's also the question of language. Humans link math with symbols and words. 2, 5, infinity. Animals don't have those words, but does that mean they don't have the concepts? Imagine you were born without language. You'd still feel the difference between 1 apple and 2 apples. You'd still notice if your share was smaller. So maybe animals do understand math, they just don't name it. Of course, philosophers have been wrestling with this forever. Plato thought numbers existed in some perfect realm beyond the physical world. Aristotle thought numbers were properties of things in the world. Modern cognitive science says numbers live in brains, as neural patterns. But then we find those patterns in animal brains too, which means math might not be an invention at all. It might be a discovery, something written into the universe, and animals like us are simply tapping into it. Here's a fun way to think about it. When a crow counts hunters, when a bee recognizes zero, when a dog sulks because it got fewer treats, they're all glimpsing the same mathematical truth we glimpse when we solve equations. The difference is, we climb higher up the ladder, they stay close to the ground, but we're all on the same ladder. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful, because it means math isn't just a human language, it's a universal one. It's the rhythm of survival, the structure of choices, the balance of fairness. It's not just about blackboards filled with symbols, it's about life itself. So do animals really understand math? Maybe not in the way a mathematician would define it. They're not proving theorems or inventing calculus, but in their own worlds, they're mathematicians all the same. Their math is practical, lived, embodied, and maybe that's the truest form of math there is. Up to this point, we've been laughing at clever crows, cheeky monkeys, and surprisingly judgmental sheep. But here's the thing, studying animal math hasn't just been about entertaining stories. It's actually changed human science. The way we understand psychology, education, even artificial intelligence has been influenced by experiments with animals counting peanuts, tapping hooves, or dancing in figure eights. Let's rewind to Clever Hans, the horse who did math but really just read body language. His story didn't end as a joke. It became a scientific turning point. Psychologists realized that if animals were this good at reading human signals, then researchers had to be extremely careful. Otherwise, they'd trick themselves into thinking an animal understood math when really it was just picking up on subtle cues. That realization gave birth to stricter scientific methods, double-blind experiments, controls and rules about separating observers from subjects. In a way, Hans made modern psychology more rigorous. Not bad for a horse who just wanted oats. Then there are the primate experiments. When researchers taught chimps to recognize numbers or capuchins to use money, they weren't just trying to show off how smart monkeys are. They were testing the roots of human cognition. If animals can learn numbers, it suggests those abilities aren't cultural inventions but evolutionary inheritances. That shifts our understanding of human development. Instead of math being this weird quirk of civilization, it looks more like a natural extension of ancient brain wiring. This insight had huge ripple effects in education. Early on, teachers assumed kids learnt math from scratch as if they were blank slates. But animal studies showed otherwise. Even fish can tell more from less. Even chicks can recognize missing objects. That means humans are born with a number sense, a built-in foundation. Education researchers use this to redesign how we teach children. Instead of drilling them endlessly, teachers started building on the innate number instincts kids already have. So the next time a child learns to count blocks, thank a crow or a monkey. They helped prove the brain was ready for math before school even started. Animal math also shook up neuroscience. When scientists discovered that monkeys and birds had specific brain cells firing for numbers, It suggested math isn't something that floats abstractly in our heads, it's tied to real biology. The same types of neurons light up in humans when we solve equations. That overlap shows our math abilities are variations on a theme that runs across species. The idea that number sense is hardwired into the brain was revolutionary. And then there's artificial intelligence. Believe it or not, AI researchers looked to animal cognition for inspiration. Before building machines that could calculate, they asked, what's the simplest kind of math intelligence? How does nature do it? Animals gave them clues. For example, pigeons learning probability influenced how scientists thought about machine learning systems that get better by spotting patterns. Monkeys making economic choices helped model algorithms for decision-making under risk. Even bees inspired optimization algorithms. When computers solve problems about efficiency, they sometimes use bee algorithms based on how bees find the shortest path to flowers. So yes, your GPS owes a little something to honeybees. Philosophers too got shaken up by animal math. For centuries, humans assumed math was uniquely ours, proof of our superior intelligence. But when animals started showing math skills, the line between us and them blurred. If a parrot can add, if a bee can understand zero, if a chimp can beat us at memory games, then math isn't a crown jewel of humanity. It's part of a much larger story of cognition across life. That doesn't make us less special. It just means we're part of a bigger club. And then there's the practical impact. Knowing animals can count changed how we treat them. Farmers realized their animals notice missing companions. Zoos and sanctuaries designed enrichment programs that included number games to keep animals mentally active. Even pet owners began to rethink their dogs and cats, recognizing they weren't just responding blindly, but actually keeping track of routines, meals, and fairness. The science of animal math didn't just stay in the lab, it changed how humans care for animals in the real world. Here's the funny thing. In trying to teach animals math, we ended up learning more about ourselves. We discovered our number sense is not some divine spark, but a very old tool, sharpened by evolution. We learnt our teaching methods work better when they build on instincts. We even built smarter computers by imitating birds and bees. In the end, maybe we didn't teach animals math, they taught us. And that flips the whole perspective. Instead of laughing at a monkey using tokens or a dog sulking about unfair treats, maybe we should see them as colleagues. Primitive mathematicians, sure, but colleagues nonetheless. They remind us that intelligence comes in many forms. Some of it writes equations on blackboards, some of it taps hooves, some of it dances in figure eights. But it's all connected. So the next time you pull out your phone calculator, just remember, the logic behind it might have started with a crow keeping track of hunters, or a chimp counting bananas. Animal math didn't just entertain us, it shaped science, education, and even technology. And that's a legacy worth more than any number of bananas. By now, we've seen that animals can count, calculate, and even run little economies with tokens. But here's the big twist. The way animals learn math is inspiring how we build and train robots. Yep, the future of artificial intelligence might end up looking a lot like the experiments we've been laughing about, teaching machines the same way we teach monkeys, pigeons, or even bees. Let's start with how animals actually learn. None of them are sitting down for math class. You don't see a crow with a notebook or a chimp with a calculator. Instead, they learn through experience. Rewards, patterns, repetition. A pigeon pecks the right button and gets food. A monkey taps the right symbol and gets a grape. Over time, they figure out the rules. That's basically reinforcement learning. And fun fact, that's also how we train AI. Think about it. When a self-driving car learns to navigate traffic, it doesn't start with advanced calculus. It learns step by step. If it makes the right decision, it gets rewarded with a successful trip. If it makes a bad decision, it gets penalized. Slowly, it builds up patterns. That's the same trial and error system a dog uses to figure out how many treats it can sneak from the table. The algorithms in modern AI are cousins to the learning processes of animals. And it doesn't stop there. Remember the bees and their honeycomb optimization? Computer scientists literally use that. Bee algorithms are a thing. Engineers studied how bees find efficient routes to flowers and applied those strategies to logistics and network design. So the next time your GPS finds the fastest route, thank the bees. They were doing traffic optimization long before Google Maps. The same goes for flocking fish and birds. Researchers looked at how schools of fish coordinate without bumping into each other. and how flocks of starlings move in perfect harmony. Then they applied those principles to swarm robotics. Picture tiny robots working together in a warehouse, moving packages without colliding. That's basically robot fish schooling across a factory floor. Even monkeys and their token economies have something to teach us. Economists and AI designers are fascinated by how primates respond to risk and reward. If a monkey hesitates to gamble on a bad bet, that's a clue to how basic brains weigh probability. Feed that insight into AI, and suddenly you can design machines that make smarter financial decisions, or at least avoid blowing all their digital bananas on bad trades. But here's where it gets really interesting. AI researchers are realizing that sometimes it's better to teach machines like we teach animals, not like we teach humans. Instead of overwhelming them with rules and abstract concepts, you give them environments to explore. You let them play, experiment, make mistakes, and slowly discover patterns. That's how crows learn to drop stones into water, how chimps learn number sequences, and how pigeons learn probabilities. It's also how machines can learn strategies without being explicitly told what to do. This has huge implications for the future. Imagine robots that learn like dogs by noticing routines, keeping track of fairness, and anticipating needs. Or drones that navigate like bees, dancing their data back to the hive. Or financial AIs that trade like monkeys, cautious of loss but eager for a good deal. The overlap between animal cognition and machine learning isn't just cute, it's powerful. Of course, there's a philosophical side too. If animals and robots learn in similar ways, what does that say about intelligence? Maybe it's not about being human at all. Maybe intelligence is just the ability to recognize patterns, adapt to rules, and keep track of quantities. If that's the case, then a pigeon, a monkey, and a robot vacuum cleaner are all dancing around the same campfire of mathematics. Some with wings, some with fur, some with Wi-Fi. And here's the fun part. Robots might end up teaching us too. Just like studying animals changed how we understand human learning, building AI could show us new sides of math we hadn't thought about. Machines don't get bored, they don't roll their eyes in class. They just keep running experiments until something clicks. In a way, they're like hyper-focused pigeons with unlimited snacks. So where does this go? Picture a future classroom. On one side, a group of children learning math through games and stories. On the other side, a group of AI robots running simulations to learn the same rules. And outside the window, a flock of pigeons pecking out probability problems on the sidewalk. Everyone learning together, just at different speeds. It might sound silly, but the truth is, animal math and machine math are blending into one big story. We humans used to think we stood alone with our symbols and theorems, but now we see that math is a universal skill. Bees, monkeys, machines, they all share it. The future won't be about separating them, it'll be about connecting them. We've made it. From counting crows to probability pigeons, from sneaky monkeys to geometry-loving bees, along the way we've discovered that math isn't locked away in human brains. It's all around us, woven into the lives of animals that don't carry calculators, don't scribble equations, and don't care about grades, but still somehow use numbers every single day. So, what do we actually learn from all this? First, math is older than we think. Way older. Humans didn't invent the idea of more versus less. That was there long before we carved tally marks on bones. Fish already knew that joining the bigger school meant better survival odds. Sheep already knew when one lamb went missing. Bees already knew that hexagons were the best storage solution. We didn't create math out of nothing. We stumbled into a world where math was already at work. Second, math doesn't always look like math. We picture math as chalkboards, symbols, maybe terrifying exams. But for animals, math is lived experience. It's survival math. A raven keeps track of how many hunters are hiding. A monkey weighs risk versus reward when gambling for grapes. A dog sulks when its sibling gets more treats. They're not solving problems in the way we define it. They're living problems and solving them every day. Third, animals remind us that understanding is relative. Does a crow understand zero the way a human philosopher does? Probably not. But does it grasp the difference between something and nothing? Absolutely. Does a chimp know what order means in an abstract sense? No. But does it know that 1 comes before 2 and 2 comes before 3? Yes. Maybe we shouldn't measure their math by whether they can do calculus. Maybe we should measure it by how well it helps them survive. And by that standard, they're doing just fine. Fourth, animal math reshapes how we see ourselves. We used to think numbers set us apart, proof that humans were special. But the more we study animals, the more we realize math is shared. It's not a crown jewel of humanity. It's a common language, one that birds, fish, primates, and humans all speak, just with different accents. That doesn't make us less special. It makes the world more connected. And finally, animal math teaches us humility. Think about it. A pigeon can run statistics better than most of us like to admit. A chimp can beat us in memory games. A bee figured out hexagons before we did. A horse tricked scientists into rewriting psychology textbooks. Over and over, animals remind us that intelligence comes in many forms, and we're not always the best at everything. Sometimes the crow wins, sometimes the monkey wins, and that's okay. So where does that leave us? Maybe with a new definition of mathematics itself, not just a human invention filled with symbols and proofs, but a universal toolkit for navigating reality. Math isn't just what happens in classrooms, it's what happens every time an animal keeps track, compares, or anticipates. Math is life's way of making sense of quantity, order, and pattern. And if that's true, then maybe we've been looking at it the wrong way. Instead of saying humans invented math, maybe we should say math discovered us. It was already here, waiting in the flocks of birds, the swarms of bees, the herds of sheep, and the curious minds of monkeys. We just put it into words and symbols. But the roots, those were already alive, buzzing, crawling, and flying around us. So next time you see a crow cawing on a telephone wire, or a pigeon pacing in a city square, or your dog glaring at you because you gave it one treat instead of two, take a moment. You're looking at a fellow mathematician. Maybe not the kind who'll write the next big theorem, but a mathematician all the same. Because math isn't just ours, it's nature's. And in one way or another, we're all counting. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the calculating animals. From the skies to the seas, from stables to jungles, math has been everywhere we looked. And maybe the real lesson is simple. When you strip away the symbols, the proofs, and the chalk dust, math isn't about numbers on paper. It's about survival, fairness, connection, and curiosity. And those things, they're universal. So sleep well tonight, knowing this. Somewhere out there, a crow is still keeping score, a chimp is still remembering numbers faster than you can, and a bee is still wiggling its way through a geometry lecture. The world is full of mathematicians. You just have to look closely enough to see them.